Hey everybody, this is Marina, your podcast host at UNBOSSED. Here we go. At UNBOSSED, I interview amazing women in Chicago. There is so much woman power in this city that I want to provide these women a platform to tell their story. Please connect with us and please consider supporting by sharing, liking, commenting the podcast. Tell all your Netflix friends and family about it. Submit a recommendation for a guest, subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and donate by clicking on the anchor link and help me continue to make great episodes. I hope you enjoy and welcome to the show. Hey everybody, this is Marina. I'm your podcast host at UNBOSSED. Today with me, I have Miloney Thakrar. She is the founder and principal at Mind the Gender Gap. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, you're the first one at my house. Everybody,
so excited to be here in front of your science fiction books.
Yeah, all the books. If you are not like watching us on YouTube, there's a bunch of books in the background. We're just chilling at my house. We have a big light. We have 2 cameras going on. I hope you can see this at some point and enjoy. But otherwise, please just listen to us and our story here. So, Erica Zaza referred you to the podcast.
Yeah.
We have her in common, so shout out to Erica. But specifically, let's get into your story.
Sure.
Right? So, tell me a little bit about you growing up and what is a story that maybe represents to you and the work that you're going to be talking to us about today?
Well, wow, that's a big question.
Okay, tiny question. Where did you grow up?
Where did I grow up? So I actually, a lot of people don't know this about me, but I spent a part of my childhood in Texas.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Where?
So in Dallas.
My mom is from Dallas too, so.
And so I did have a very thick Texan accent.
And while looking like this.
Yeah, while rocking the bowl cut. So it was a very memorable time in my life. And it was also during the time where most of my extended family, even to this day, but back then as well, were based in Chicago. So it was always my dream to finally make finally make our way back to Chicago. But I was born in the suburbs of Chicago, so it was sort of coming full circle.
Yeah. So I lived in Houston for a little bit.
Oh, you
so
did?
I drove a 12-foot truck when I moved from Texas to Chicago. Through the United States.
Amazing.
Did you ever drive the 12-foot truck?
I did not drive a 12-foot truck. I was in Texas from ages 2 to 7, so they wouldn't let me. But I do remember. I think my dad was an engineer, and it was fairly common for people who worked in engineering and construction to have the big pickup trucks. But we didn't actually go that route. We stuck with the niece. So
it was you and your dad. And tell me about the influences that you have around.
Sure. So just a little bit of context is my family was in a car accident when I was an infant, and both my brother and my mother passed away in that car accident. And so my father played obviously a critical role in my upbringing as the sole parental figure. And I asked him a few years ago, actually, what was his favorite memory of me. And of course he says, he talks about the age when I was 4 years old, because that was his favorite age. And he much more enjoyed me as a small child than he does now. But, and, he said, we were in Target, which nothing extraordinary about that, but, Tina Turner's What's Love Got to Do With It? It comes on the intercom, and I was really into that song at that time, because it was always playing on the radio, and, just, again, I was at 4, so I was still developing my language skills, but I was like, Daddy, got to do, and he burst out laughing, and I think when I think about that story, in my childhood is how you derive meaning and humor from the most ordinary of moments, and then my father being sort of the sole parental figure for much of my childhood. Like, it was very common for us to go run errands together because there wasn't another parent to pass me off to. So, yeah, and at the time, Target was very big in Texas. Like, it wasn't really big in Chicago. So I was so excited when Target finally made its arrival here. And then another story that comes to mind is I was recently, or not recently, but like a few years ago, I was doing a lot of Marie Kondoing, physical decluttering. And and there was 2 big boxes, like, from my childhood, and one of the patterns that emerged, so to speak, was a lot of the toys that I got were basically like these computers with educational games on them. This is before the ages of the iPad and laptop, so that was the closest thing I got. And they just had these like banks of different questions, like covering different topics. And then another pattern that, like, similarly, like, another thing that I noticed in these boxes was a lot of the educational workbooks where you get, like, stickers and whatnot if you finish the exercises. And I think that's such a great reflection of the value my father instilled in me. He always used to say, like, no one can ever take away your education.
Oh,
right?
yeah, that's good.
And so for a very young age, as a typical Asian child, like, education was always considered one of the most important things to, like, focus on.
Yeah, and speaking of your heritage, you're like South Asian from, do you know where your ethnical background is?
Sure, yeah. So my ancestors are from Gujarat in India, but my both my parents were born and raised in East Africa, so it's sort of a subculture of Indians. There's East African Indians. There's actually
I actually was aware of this.
Yeah, there's actually an East African Indian Association that my parents are very much a part of back in the day. And you know, when I think about sort of the, like, this is the story of my ancestors of, like, immigrating from India and to Africa in pursuit of economic opportunity.
Was that the reason?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. And then there's actually it's been out for a few years now, but there's an Economist article that specifically talks about Gujarati Indians being very entrepreneurial, and they actually highlight the story of an Indian migrating to East Africa and Tanzania specifically. So my mom was born and raised in Malawi, and my father was born and raised in Tanzania.
Wow. So. And have you ever gone back to?
I have not. It's been on my bucket list for a while, but it's one of those where when I go, I'm going to go for a while, like, not just like a 1 week, 2 weeks trip. So yeah,
it makes sense. Like, you want to just explore, soak it in,
right?
Really, like, be part of it. I get it.
Yeah,
it's nice.
Yeah.
So you are also a traveler, and we can.
Yeah, I'm not so much now, thanks to
your ticket prices are extremely cheap.
yeah, I have been looking. I've been looking.
But no, like, your dad. You and your dad must have been super close, and he gave you this, like, powerful statement about education and skill set that you've carried over, and you've taken that, and based on your resume, right?
Yeah.
You've, like, had earned quite a pedigree, including. I'm gonna let you talk about.
You're gonna make me talk about. So yeah, I just, like, as a backstory to provide a little bit of context, just. My family at this point has lived in basically 4 different continents. Like, my ancestors are from India. My parents were born and raised in Africa. They lived in London for several years before migrating to the U.S. So I felt like when thinking about my family story, I was always curious and interested about learning different cultures and visiting other places at any opportunity I got. while I was deciding whether to where to go to for undergrad, you know, I had a lot of pressure from family to go to the standard state school, University of Illinois. And the compromise was, well, you can go anywhere for grad school if you go in-state for undergrad. And so I took them up on that. So like when grad school came around, I spent a year in Australia and a year in the UK, the London School of Economics. And I basically had gotten 2 master's degrees in 2 years in 2 different countries. Yeah. I don't know if it's actually the silliest thing I've ever done or the smartest thing I've ever done, but I was like, it's grad school. I can study grad school. And, you know, both of those experiences were great, both academically as well as, you know.
And so, how did that work? Because now I'm just curious.
Okay, so how to be fair,
2 grad school degrees in 2 years from 2 different schools.
To be fair, this wasn't part of the initial plan, but life is what happens when you make that plan. So, what happened was I had applied for a scholarship, and I had to apply for the scholarship before I applied to grad school, and it was one of those scholarships where ultimately they decide where you go. Like you can list your top priority schools. And initially when I applied for the scholarship, I'm like, I just put down London School of Economics. And the committee that sort of helped prepare me and coach me for the application came back and said, listen, we think you're a really strong candidate, but you should put down another school besides London School of Economics because it's really competitive. And although I do speak Spanish, like I couldn't see myself completing a grad school program in Spanish. And so I stuck with English speaking schools. And so naturally, like Australia came up as like one of the places. And then like they had told me this like right before the official deadline, even though I had submitted my application like a few months in advance. So I was like just frantically looking at the internet. I'm like, okay, this one looks good. It's a college school, and I slapped it down. I think I put down Australia as like my 3rd or 4th choice, and so I found out in August that I got the scholarship.
Ooh.
And at that point, I didn't know where it was placed, but it's like they slowly string you along. And then a couple months later, I found out I got into grad school, and then I found out that I got placed in a different place for my for the scholarship. And so my dilemma was.
Do I go to London School of Economics, or do I go to SHRM?
Yeah, and one of my colleagues who was also very well traveled, he's like, well, why does it have to be one or the other? Like, can't you just defer London? I'm like, I'm pretty sure they'll let you defer. And I was like, okay, because I had my heart set up like with the School of Economics, and so I said, well, if I get the deferral, which isn't something they always grant easily, I'll go to both, but if I don't get the deferral, I'm just going to go to London. And so that's sort of how that happened. But yeah, it was.
Who is this, God bless, colleague of yours who was like, why not both? He's audacious.
Yeah.
I hear her. I don't know. He's like, why not both? I like it.
Yeah, he was one of my colleagues in the employment opportunity questions.
Yeah. Why not?
Exactly. Why can't you have both hands?
You can have and. That was like nice.
Yeah.
No, that's cool. That's a good story. Okay, so you got your whole education experience, and then you haven't even actually talked at all about what you went to school for, which is like really important.
Sure.
Potentially.
I guess. Really.
No, but let's get into that, and then let's talk about how it evolved. And I don't want to necessarily like minimize your early experience, but I wanted to get fast track to a little bit of what we're going to talk into, like what we do now.
Sure.
So let's go through, what you studied in school, and then how did it evolve into your early career?
Sure. So again, a little bit of context. So in undergrad, I completed this program called the Public Policy and International Affairs Junior Summer Institute, which is a mouthful, but basically it was a prep program for grad school, and it really introduced me to the field of public policy. And at that point in my life, I really wanted to pursue a career in public service.
Yeah.
And it was also a phenomenal program because I met these amazing people from all over the country, who I'm still, many of with whom I'm still really good friends with.
Yeah.
And so up until that point, I hadn't really taken any policy per se classes, but that was the main introduction, where we took an econ course and other policy related courses, and then a part of that program was actually having people who were working in the field coming in and talking about their experience and where they worked. So from that point on, I was fairly clear that I wanted to get my degree in policy, and it wasn't until I my first job out of undergrad, which was working at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that I sort of clarified that I really wanted to focus on gender and policy.
And is that is a specialization?
Well, at the time in the U.S., it was not. It did not exist. There are some programs now, but there wasn't really a specialty. But I really wanted to focus on gender issues within the field of policy. Yeah. And the closest that came to it is you get into a policy program and you can take a course in gender and whatnot. And so what I loved about, what really drew me to the London School of Economics was that it's like the school of 10,000 master degrees. Like, you can choose your own adventure. And so they had a degree program. Seriously, they have 10,000 and they had a program specifically on gender and social policy, and they had a gender institute. And so that's how I sort of decided, this is the school I want to go to, and this is the program I want to do. Because at that time, there wasn't really any options in the U.S. Around that. Now there are, but at the time when I went to grad school, which is more than a decade ago now, that was really only the only option I had.
Okay, so by the way, I love London.
Yeah.
And that's one of my favorite cities in the world. Best and worst parts of London. Best and worst things about London, quickly.
Okay, sure.
Because I dig London so much.
Okay, so visiting London as a tourist is very different than living in London.
Absolutely. So the most I spent in London was 4 months.
Okay, well that's still a reasonable amount of time. So I will say the lack of sunshine really got to me.
And we're in Chicago, so.
Yeah. But I think the other sort of ramification of that is people are very grumpy because of the lack of sunshine. And including myself, I felt like I was grumpier because of the lack of sunshine. And I was like, oh my gosh, what does the sun even look like anymore? And it was very damp, so their living conditions, a lot of the houses were much older than many of the places that are available in the U.S. And so there's just there are some realities of living there, mold is very common. Just living in damp quarters is very common, and mice were very common as well. But when you think about it in terms of the big picture, those things are sort of trivial when you think about what a phenomenal experience and opportunity to be able to study at the world-renowned institution, just to live in a place where my parents lived for several years. It was sort of a way to
reconnect.
Yeah, And like even when I go for runs in the morning along the Thames, there was all these like historic buildings, like so it's those moments, and then even like being able to study with and have peers from all over the world who were like some of the most brilliant people.
I'm extremely shallow. I like London for other reasons. The accents,
the accents are party. Yeah.
Let me see what else. No, it's a beautiful city.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on. Public policy, gender focus.
Yeah.
And then, what did you study in London and Australia?
So, in Australia, I studied public policy, and in London, I studied gender and social policy.
Yes.
So I think of them as like one degree is more like a generalist degree, and one was more of a specialist degree. That's how in my mind how I rationalized getting two master's degrees.
And so then, with this passion, right? You come out of this and this, and are you working at the same time?
No, I decided. Yeah.
So you go into the workforce and you get slammed in the face with reality. Probably is that how it goes?
Yeah, like I entered the workforce, re-entered rather, during the recession, which wasn't the most ideal time to be entering the workforce. But
and then you came back to the university.
Yeah. And what was interesting coming back at that time is I really felt like I had to justify my global degrees.
Why?
I don't know.
But justify.
This wasn't even for a full-time job. This was for an internship in between the degrees. I interviewed for an organization that had the word global in it, and I got grilled about my decisions to go abroad to complete my grad school.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I'm very serious. And so, and that's something, I thought London School of Economics.
It is the London School of Economics.
Yeah, it is the London School of Economics.
What questions?
And honestly, that's why I got the two degrees, because I knew with just having Australian National University, even though it is a very good, high caliber school academically, most people in the U.S. haven't ever heard of it. So I felt
most people in the U.S. have never heard of NYU either. Like, that has never
I guess that's a whole other matter about living in the USA. But yeah, so it was a little bit of an uphill battle. I initially started working for a nonprofit that focused on human trafficking and child trafficking. And
such an important space.
Yeah, and there was a lot of interesting stuff happening, and still is, in the state of Illinois around passing sort of innovative legislation around anti-trafficking laws.
Yeah.
And around that same time, I also served on a board for an organization that focused on sex trafficking. So that was kind of the lane I was started out in, and then quickly realized that I wanted to do work that was more analytical in nature versus simply focusing on programming. And that's why I sort of shifted into working in the research and evaluation field, which is basically assessing, for lack of a better word, the impact of these larger, broader initiatives. And I felt like that was sort of a good shift for me. And looking at when we look at these like broader initiatives or large-scale initiatives, whether it's focusing on gender equity or racial equity or workforce development, that it was really important to think through and ask the questions of what impact is this initiative really having at the end of the day. And most people either who are doing the work or investing the work aren't able to answer those questions right off the bat.
Yeah. How did that move you into starting your own thing?
Well, that was a journey. It's been a very long, winding path. Yeah. So when I was working in research and evaluation, I did have the luxury of being able to work on a portfolio of work that focused on gender equity. And so that was very fulfilling and interesting to me. But when I pulled out and looked at the broader picture, that work was only made up a small percentage of my workload, and that was the type of work I wanted to do more of, and the work I was most excited about, and the work that I did the best in. Like I showed, when you're most excited about it, that's where you do your best work. And whenever I would broach the subject of how can I broaden this pocket of work more so that it takes up more of my workload, I felt like I always got a little bit of pushback. And an example of this was on my professional development plan. I put down gender equity expert as one of my professional development goals, and my supervisor at the time physically crossed that off my plan, and I was like, oh, and I didn't think of it as my personal professional goals were independent of or mutually exclusive of the business goals. I felt like there was an opportunity to expand that portfolio of work, and the people I worked with just weren't aligned or on the same page around that thinking. And there was just some it was just a time where I had to eventually move back closer to the bird's nest because most of my extended family's here and my father's here, and the role reversal between parent and child became all of a sudden. And so I said, well, I guess now's the time to, see how this path unfolds. And so that's partly how I ended up wanting to carve my own path.
That is also what it takes, a lot of knowing what you want. And you've been pursuing this for so long. It must be extremely satisfying to be doing this all the time now.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, there was, the first couple years, I was doing interesting work, but it wasn't necessarily fully aligned with what I envisioned the work that I really wanted to be doing and the skill sets I really wanted to apply. I don't think it's until recently that I've been able to...
it takes a bit of time.
Yeah,
really
I mean, and just the path of the entrepreneur, there's so many, I think of it as riding a roller coaster blindfolded and you don't know when you're gonna get off. That. I mean, it is there's nothing to glamorize about
Technically, we could try to do that. We could go to Six Flags.
we could. I mean, is Six Flags open? I don't even know.
It is open. Just went this summer with the girls.
Okay.
We could blindfold ourselves.
Is this gonna be part of your podcast?
It's all surprises. Stay tuned. That could be fun. No. But yeah, I totally agree. And I keep wondering, there's this one question that comes back to me all the time. It's why gender equity? I get it.
Sure.
I get it's important, but why are you
sure.
specifically doing gender?
So, just to provide a little bit of context, so my mother, when she immigrated to the U.S., she was pregnant with me, and she wasted no time to secure a minimum wage job at Toys R Us, and shortly thereafter she secured a job at a life insurance company. And as you can imagine, this company provided benefits such as health insurance, which was critical for expecting mother, and maternity leave, which was also nice to have for expecting mother, as you know, being a mother yourself. And this all happened in the middle of recession. And her health insurance benefits literally, and her maternity leave benefits literally kicked in right before I was born. And I think about that story, I mean, it's very much a story that's uniquely my mother's, but at the same time, it's very much resonates the experience of immigrant women moving to this country and trying to build a life for their families. Yeah. And when you look on a macro level, it wouldn't be any less miraculous today for a woman who is brown-skinned, immigrant from Malawi, one of the poorest countries in the world, 6 months pregnant, to secure a job that had good benefits. Like, it'd be almost impossible. Just as much of it as a miracle it was today, it'd be just as miraculous. As much as it was a miracle back then, it would be just as miraculous today. And that is a point of frustration for me. Like, I don't think...
When did you learn this, though?
I think I really... what really opened my eyes that this was the reality is my first job out of undergrad was working at the working at the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And there I had to investigate workplace discrimination cases.
Oh my God.
And so my job was literally to listen to people's stories in graphic detail of the challenges and adversity they face. Including women.
Or especially?
Especially women. Especially women of color.
Yeah.
So I kind of did things backwards, where I saw how things were working on the ground first, and then went to grad school to learn the theory behind intersectionality and what have you.
That is perfect.
When I listened to these stories, I couldn't help but think about my mother's story.
Yeah.
And I think, like, having a job so that where you're treated with a certain level of respect and dignity should just be a standard or a status quo, but it is not.
Minimal.
Yeah.
I have two things to say. One is, I struggle with this now. Like, maternity leave is, I've been blessed that a company I work for gave me 6 months of maternity leave almost.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Paid completely for my care, basically, without even tapping into my insurance. I am so grateful. Right? Yeah. Grateful. Because I did not qualify for FMLA. And even if I did, it would be unpaid leave.
Right.
And I do not, like, it hurts me to think, like, how do women do it? Right? And I couldn't, I don't know why do we think that it's okay to leave women behind this way? I don't understand.
Yeah, particularly in the U.S. Like,
particularly in
the U.S. is the only OECD country
that does not care.
That does not provide paid paternal leave, and even like caregiving leave, they're ranked the lowest. And so, in that context, the U.S. is one of the least family friendly
places, which is so weird because everybody has a family, right?
Right.
And we hear about our children so much. Right?
Yeah.
So totally. I will also say that your story is so unique and so special. You mentioned a concept like intersectionality. I want to get into that.
Sure.
But I would love for you to tell us and inform the audience here, like, what do you do now? What is your company?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess we should cover that.
I brought you all the way back, then I got you here. So
sure.
So here we are. So, like, tell us, like, what do you specialize in? What do you are passionate about? And then let's go into, like, some terminology, like intersectionality.
Sure.
And diversity and equity. And what does that stuff mean?
Sure. So my company is called Mind the Gender Gap.
Mind the Gender. Which is very random.
Yeah. But really, it's a boutique consultancy that helps companies accelerate intersectional gender equity by leveraging technology and data storytelling.
Wow.
Which I know is a lot, so I'm happy to unpack it. I can happy to unpack it.
Yeah, let's unpack it.
So the first jargony word we can unpack, even though I try not to be too jargony, is intersectional gender equity or intersectionality. And that was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw that really sort of highlighted that women of color, in particular in the workplace, experience interlocking systems of oppression. And the primary, in the particular context she was looking at is racism and sexism. And she sort of used the analogy of, like, a woman standing at the intersection of racism and sexism. And that's her, particularly for women of color, that's their experience in the workplace. And it's uniquely different than someone that would just experience solely racism versus solely sexism. And so, and that applied to my mother's experience, and that still applies to many women of color in the U.S. context. And so that's why I wrote my master's thesis on intersectionality within the context of workplace discrimination. And it was an interesting time to explore that topic in the UK, because at the time they had a commission that focused specifically on racial equality, and then they had another commission that focused on gender equality. So it wasn't combined, whereas in the US, there were several different bases that were under one organization that was being covered.
Okay. So intersectionality of gender, say that one more time, intersectionality of gender equity?
Intersectional gender equity.
Intersectional gender equity, correct.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the other part was about
technology and data storytelling.
Yeah. Visual data storytelling, right?
Well, data storytelling. Let me unpack what data storytelling is, because I think that's also a buzzword that's thrown around a lot.
Okay.
But I kind of have adopted a framework both from Brent Sykes that wrote the book on effective data storytelling that really breaks down data storytelling into three components. Okay. One is the actual data, two is the visuals, and then the third is the narrative. What I sort of also overlay that with is data feminism. So when you're looking at the data, really asking yourself, what are the gaps in the data? Who's collecting the data? What narratives are being told or derived from that data? And really thinking more critically and analytically, because having worked in the research and evaluation field for so many years, what became clear to me is data can be a very powerful tool for change. Yes. But it can also be weaponized to perpetuate inequities based on who's being invisibilized in those narratives, and in many cases the data gaps, and there are actually quite a few when you think about data. When in relation to gender issues. Yeah. So
there's so much here, which is awesome, right? And I would love to have a whole day.
Yeah, we could talk all day,
but I also want the audience to know, okay, now you said you obviously work towards gender equity and the internationalized sex and racial discrimination, and then you do analytics with data and you unpack that, and then you also take a look behind the scene and how the research is done, right? But in practice, right, if somebody was to hire, walk in the door,
right?
What do you do?
Well, it depends on the client, because working with a nonprofit or doing a research-based type project looks very different than working with a company focusing on their DEI initiatives. Yeah. So an example is one of my, just to talk real concretely without naming the actual client, but I have a client currently that is a high growth startup, but they're very early in their DEI journey. And
what that means is
they've done some things like 6 vision statements, but not a whole lot.
What that means is they're mostly men and white.
Yeah, I mean, you work in tech, so you can paint the picture, but
and that they think that may be a problem. Right, and so they're trying to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah, and so my approach typically, just also as a consultant, I try to be as pragmatic as possible. Is they've already collected a lot of data, and so really starting out what have they collected and how did they make sense of that data? Because usually what clients need the most support with is not collecting data. They already have plenty of data to work with. Is how do you make sense of that and translate that data into actionable insights that inform effective decision making? And we're still very early in the journey, but really talking through what existing data that they have, and then starting to have the conversation when there is different stakeholders in the company who have different perspectives of where the company's at when it comes to their DEI journey to have
Interesting.
conversations.
And we talk a lot about the DEI journey here, and I may like do another break and then we'll go back to it.
Okay.
Because this is like I want to finish this.
Sure.
And have like a smaller conversation. But in terms of like DEI journey, maybe like we can leave the audience with this before the break. And is what is important about the DEI journey right now? Why are people adopting it? And generally like frame a DEI journey kind of thing for a company, and briefly if you can.
Well, I think when thinking about the DEI journey, I think it's important to understand the organization's readiness for change, because usually when it comes to DEI, it's about changing the status quo or how typically things are done at the company.
And power dynamics.
Yeah, power dynamics. And so there's that, and part of that conversation is also really getting clear on how much the company is going to invest in that effort, both pragmatically in terms of actual dollars, staff, and how the company collectively is going to take ownership of that initiative so that it's sustainable. And so that really varies. Like I don't have like a clean framework because it's so different based on what type of organization. Like working with a nonprofit is very different than a high growth tech startup. And also like, you know, just where they're at in terms of their capacity for change and how much resources they can invest in those efforts. I've found through a lot of trial and error that the organization can't be too small or too early on when building a company, either as a nonprofit or a startup, for example, because they're not quite ready to build out the systems and processes and infrastructure. And at the same time, if they're too big, it almost feels like they're so well established in their systems and processes that it's really hard
to change.
Move the needle on those efforts.
Okay, beautiful. Let's take a break, and then we'll be back in 2 minutes. Let's see. So we were talking about DEI and what that means for companies. So like, I'm gonna be honest here,
sure,
because like I don't know how to do this.
Bring it.
But I'm like, I had this woman who was running this company that I used to work for, and she sat with me and she's like, Marina, do you know why 95% of my C-suite is women? It's because I'm a woman, right?
Okay.
Do you also know why 95% of my C-suite is white? Because I'm white.
Wow. She said that out loud.
Yes, she said that out loud. And so I was like, okay, cool. So then, you know, can you turn brown or something so that we can just have more brown people around here? I was like, you know, and that's like part of her like awareness was the fact that like she was able to recognize that is a mirror almost, right? And leadership is like almost like self-reflecting, right? And so my point to that is like, people that say, I'm trying to figure out how to have more women on my board. Oh, I'm trying to figure out how to have more women VPs that are colored or generally more women. My answer to that is just like hire more. Just hire them.
Right.
You know,
right.
just do it.
Right.
So to me, DEI programs, I understand the need. I want us to talk about the need for them.
Sure.
But also like it feels a little bit hoaxy.
Sure. No, for sure. Well, first of all, I felt, and I still sometimes feel comfortable like branding myself in the DEI space.
Okay.
And partly because when you think about the field and how they frame solutions, they're not necessarily framed to dismantle systems of oppression. And when you think about systems of oppression and how they show up in the workplace, they are very ubiquitous, they are very sophisticated, and they're very durable. And the DEI field...
What is an example of a system of oppression in the workplace? generally speaking.
I mean, just like a simple thing is like the standard, a common standard in the workplace is to do a 40-hour work week minimum for a professional full-time job.
That's a system of, you're totally right. I just discovered this.
Yeah.
I was like,
but like, who made up this rule?
Yeah.
I guarantee you it wasn't an expecting mother who realizes that they spend the majority of their time with their caregiver as like, fulfilling their caregiving responsibilities and taking care of the children. Because when you look at time studies, regardless of how egalitarian the households are, generally speaking, it's the mother that devotes most of the time to caregiving, and that doesn't make a difference if it's a dual income household where both
I have to shut up my husband because he's taking care of the baby right now. I'm here.
Yeah. No, but like another thing is there's no there, and this is on the docket right now in being argued in the House is in Congress, is we don't have paid leave in the U.S. And who does that impact the most?
Women.
Yeah.
I mean, of course.
And
also, don't get me started on freaking Texas and abortion laws.
Yeah. I mean, like we're losing. This is the other thing about like thinking about the story of my mother. Like, first of all, we lived in Texas, so that kind of hit home harder than I would have liked. But when we look at the data, especially with the pandemic, we regressed back to 1998 in terms of labor force participation rates for women.
Yes.
And we are sort of at a critical juncture. Like, we really need to ask ourselves why that is and what are some sustainable solutions to address that. Because if we don't, we're not talking about just one woman benefiting this or a group of women benefiting. We're talking about our economy. We're talking about like our society.
Yeah. We're talking about our children.
Yeah.
We're talking about not only our women, girls, but also our boys.
Yeah.
It's like it's all impregnated based on distributing all over.
Right.
But and then my point is the same though. Like, let's go vote for women, right? Like, let's put women that do suffer, let's put them up there, right? But then I know you have a counter argument to this.
Well, I don't.
It's not counter. Is in addition. Yeah. Even.
Well, I think it's nuanced because I don't. People just automatically assume that because I have an organization called Mind the Gender Gap, that the solution is just to have women in leadership, and I think that is definitely critical.
I wonder, like, I think it's like one of the most powerful.
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of data that shows how we would be happier, healthier, wealthier, generally speaking.
If women led this country.
Yeah, but there's also there has been, like, situations and contexts where women leadership haven't necessarily helped dismantle patriarchy.
Okay, time out. The patriarchy hasn't dismantled the patriarchy.
Yeah, right.
Just give us some time to figure it out. Like,
because because it's so ubiquitous, everyone is affected by it. So,
and there's a part of like, being the first one there and going with the game and all that good stuff, right? But we're talking about a system of oppressions in the workplace, which also reflect all of our society. And you said very much about like 40 hours work week, 8 hours of work day, right? Like those are
minimum
subtle ways, to exclude specific parts of the population, or even like the other day I was talking to a woman who is the president of a university. Like, I was telling her, even the fact that college is during the day and it happens during working hours is a system of oppression in my mind, because in Dominican Republic, for example, after your first year of college happens between there 6 p.m. and midnight, because most people go to work during the day and then go to college at night.
So when you, I mean, that's a really good example of like, there are other ways we can reimagine how we operate in society when it comes to the workplace and even pursue education while we're working.
Because the type of work that happens between the hours 6 and 12
Those are some power hours for certain people when they have to out of necessity, right? Like out of
6 and 6, right? But the type of work that happens during the 6 and 6 is not, I don't know, like I'm trying to say most of that work is not necessarily like 18-year-old, I'm going to build a good set of skill set type of work, right? Like it's specific niche type of work, and there's not as much as diversity as between the hours 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. kind of thing.
Right.
So you identify the system of oppression. So
I don't know if I identified all of them.
Dismantle.
I don't know if we have fully unpacked that, but we dabbled in it.
You go in and you tell them, look, this is what you're doing. No.
Well, it has to take. I have to learn how to be very strategic in how I broach this subject, because early on in my career, I did not have a good poker face, and I was very blunt. And that approach didn't really get me too far in terms of what I wanted to achieve. What I realized is how important the delivery and how it's delivered, and when I'm trying to communicate, what's the end goal here? What are some calculated risks I'm willing to make? And how do I communicate that effectively? And I found with that's partly why I gravitate towards data storytelling, because then I can point to this is what the data shows, and then to communicate it effectively, to really distill down what are the key points or takeaways, and then to have a nuanced discussion about that, versus either just showing them a dashboard with a bunch of metrics there where it can be a little overwhelming, or just showing them like these are the data sources you can look at. That's also very overwhelming when translating.
Or even just saying like, look, I've seen this problem many times before. This is how you do it.
Yeah. I mean, there is this balance of being compassionate and like holding them accountable. And there is no. It's like an art that I'm still learning and not by any means mastered. But like I have found when I've talked to founders of companies or CEOs of companies, and even more recently a chief data officer, like they find the data storytelling piece compelling, and that's sort of my entryway or gateway into having the more difficult and challenging conversations.
Yeah, because then it becomes, it's not a you problem, is a kind of like a system problem. Is we can solve this without personalizing it.
Yeah, and it's like learning to speak their language, right? Like, and how you communicate or talk about DEI with the ERG leader, for example, will be very different than talking to the CFO at a company, and like learning to adapt. And it almost feels like you have to be multilingual when doing this work.
And so there's probably many women that are listening that are leading DEI programs right now or are involved in it, because that's generally what happens sometimes.
Oh yeah, hopefully by choice, not out of obligation or duty.
You may be tapped on the shoulder, or by choice you have volunteered. Being voluntold, or you volunteer as a tribute. I don't know, whatever happens.
Yeah.
How do you give them a couple of tips on how to handle the adoption of DEI? Like what type of tips would you have for them that are in the midst right now? They can say, okay, how do I potentially get people to listen to this and actually invest into this?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the challenges with this work is people are always looking for the magic bullet. And the thing is, there is no magic bullet. Like, it's really starting out and understanding the context that you're operating in. Who are the key stakeholders? What is the language that they speak? And what I mean, like, what is their preferred communication method? Like, some people prefer looking at a deck versus reading a memo. Some people like having a conversation. Maybe at some point it'd be an in-person conversation versus on a Zoom call to talk things through, especially when you're trying to get nuanced conversations and try to think about, like, what do you see your role is? Like, how can you leverage your skills and strengths to move the whatever it is you're trying to move forward. But like thinking, I think it's also, you need to do some self-reflection of like, what is the point of all this, right? Like thinking both in the short term and the long term. Like if you are the ERG leader, for example, like what type of programming do you think would be valuable or meaningful to that ERG group? But how does that align with like longer term goals or with the business goals? Like I think a lot of times when I work, I've tried to align the overall business strategy with the DEI and people strategy.
Some of the most common, if you can mention a few, low-hanging fruits. The people, I'm sorry, should I not call it?
No.
Well, just because I'm sure there are some few actions that you can just start doing in order to step into this, right?
Right.
So what are some of those lower hanging fruits?
Like one is just like, it can get really overwhelming of trying to do everything at once. Yeah. And so just figuring out like what are the one or two things you can focus on within the DEI space.
What have you noticed is there commonalities across?
I mean, I think the conversation right now there's been a lot of energy around hiring efforts.
Yeah.
And working at high growth startups, they're always looking at how to scale and grow as quickly as possible and having more bodies working at their company. And similarly, like within against the backdrop of the Great Resignation, that's becoming increasingly more relevant. A lot of recruiters are asking questions of like, how do I attract people to my company to work for? How do I convince them to work for the company I'm recruiting for? And I think based on all that's happened over the past year, the conversation around DEI and social justice has sort of become front and center. So they are starting to think about, well, like how do I not just attract a workforce now that like people are paying more attention to these issues, but like how do I
fair and equitable.
Embed those values into the processes that we.
So hiring is one of the most common conversations right now.
Yeah.
Are there tactics, one or two, that you may get people started on?
Well, again, like it's based on context. So like even within hiring, there's like so layers, right? Yeah. So I think one of the challenges a lot of my clients have is they're misdiagnosing the problem, and that can be easily addressed by looking at the data more carefully. Like where in your hiring funnel are you seeing a drop in diversity? What is it you're not even getting people to apply at your company? And if so, what is that all about? Is it when they're making it to the interview stage, they're just not getting offers? So like how your strategy for addressing people not making it past the interview stage would look very different than if you're not getting people at the end. So that's just an example, and then from there to like find tools and resources to help address them.
I want to know, like, is there such a thing like one of the most simpler problems in DEI versus one of the most complex? And I wonder if it has to do, going back to that gender, sex intersectionality, and I wonder if there's something around that you can give me. And maybe that's the wrong question, but I think you know where I'm going.
Sure.
It's like, what is the spectrum maybe that you have encountered?
Yeah.
It's like maybe the lower spectrum and the higher spectrum of the systemic injustice.
Well, I think, I don't know if this really answers your question, but one of the things in the DEI space is people are looking for like quick solutions, and the reality.
I ain't even asking about it. Like, what is the law?
And it's like they want the magic bullet. Like I get this, and I'm like, there is no magic bullet. It just takes a lot of work. You know, like one of the ways that has manifested is in the DEI space. There's a multi-billion-dollar industry focusing just on DEI training, and I'm sorry, we're not going to dismantle systems oppression with a 1 or 2 day training. Like, that is not a sustainable solution. But it is a multi-billion-dollar industry because there is a demand for it and there is a supply of it. So, you know, I have been a little bit discerning with clients. I'm like, listen, if you want one day unconscious bias training, I'm not the person for you. I happily refer you to someone who will take your money for that service, but I don't do that. And I don't do that because that's what the research shows, that those are not effective. Yet, and so I think just this need or urge to like oversimplify things and do it like quickly is part of the challenge of doing work in this space. It's like one of the biggest challenges. And the other challenge I have, which is partly why I have this very jargony tagline about intersectional gender equity, is quite often when you look at publicly available DEI reports, they will break down the data and they'll look at race, and it'll be completely independent of the gender breakdowns. And the challenge with that is it's invisibilizing the narrative of what's going on for women of color, or even for men of color, depending on the sector. And so, and even non-binary folks, like they're usually when looking at the gender breakdown,
a multi-dimension.
Yeah, and so there's this tendency of not to look at the data in a nuanced way. And a lot of folks, both practitioners and consultants, don't have necessarily a background in data analytics or research. And so that's partly why I felt compelled to do the work that I do, because I felt like that could be my contribution to the field, or where I feel I can make a contribution to the field. Because I don't think when it comes to doing work around research and data, that it is something you can just sort of check off the list with like a online course. Like for me, I've treated it as a craft that I have refined over the years, and I still continue to like refine over time. And the work that I do now has really allowed me to connect the dots of my varied professional and academic experiences in a meaningful way.
I think I want to close with a project that you have experienced recently. And I'm not gonna, I'm so tempted to ask you what is the most asinine thing you've ever heard in this meeting. I don't know if I want to put that out there though, because I feel like
I can go back to my EEOC days. It's not that much time has passed, but I don't know if I could do more recent.
You know what? Let's hear it. What is the most asinine thing you've ever heard?
So I had to do a site visit as a federal investigator at the EEOC, and it was a race discrimination case. And when I was interviewing one of the key stakeholders, who was basically CEO of the company, he's like, "Well, I like black people," and like pointed to a photo of someone that he was like in a, and I'm like, okay, this was back in the day. I mean, I still don't have a good poker face, but I definitely did not have a good poker face back then.
I obviously like my people to look at this picture.
Yeah.
Took this picture. Can you see me with this picture?
Yeah.
Was there a black person in the picture?
Yes.
Okay.
But it's just like.
Yes. I know a black person, therefore I'm not racist kind of thing.
Yeah, and even like with me, people, I mean, I was recently asked this from a client. It's like, I noticed you focus a lot about gender equity, but what about racial equity? And this was coming from a black man. And I said, I definitely keep the racial equity lens front and center in my work. But most people, when I say, if I were to say mind the intersectional gap, most people don't know what I'm talking about. They barely don't talk about like the data storytelling piece. Like I have a very jargony tagline to begin with. So if I throw, it's just, so I'm like, I do bring it into my work, but
all right.
Yeah.
Let's finish with one of the projects that are most near and dear to your heart. Maybe you have one of those that really like moved you towards hope.
Towards hope.
Hope for humanity.
Hope
we are gonna
for humanity.
We're gonna be able to solve this because, like, really, that's what I care about. Like, I want to be able to put out like positivity that we are gonna at some point, hopefully, be able to. I don't know, like get equality.
Sure.
Like, I'm not even talking about fairness.
Sure.
Just like equality.
Well, somebody asked me a similar question recently, like, what's the silver lining in all this? And earlier this year, there were quite a few organizations that announced very significant investments in gender equality. PayPal, the Gates Foundation, among others. And so that's been really exciting to see and learn about. In addition, across the globe, governments have invested $17 billion in gender equality initiatives.
Nice.
I believe it's
across the globe.
Yeah,
17 billion.
So I'm sometimes bad at remembering the numbers, so we might need a fact check
because I hold that number is so much higher.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So I do find that heartening that there's been at least an understanding and awareness that it's important to focus on gender equality initiatives, like particularly because in the philanthropic space, like we talk about startups where women founders only get 2.7% or whatever VC funding. Well, in the philanthropic space, only 1.6% of funding goes to women and girls initiatives, and so I try to remain hopeful, and I am really excited to see how what all will come from these initiatives and these investments.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
It's been great.
Woo! There you have it. I hope you liked this episode, and please don't forget to share, like, comment on the podcast link. Tell all your networks and friends and family about it. Submit a recommendation for a guest at www.unbossed.io. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Donate by clicking on the anchor link and help me continue to make great episodes. You can find all this information on www.unbossed.io. See you next time. Oh, that was good.